Okay, cool. Hi, Albert team. POI preferably on the 15-minute mark. Let me just set up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in two, sorry, 3, 2, 1. The point in which people influence whatever you want comes from these people that certainly keep snagging at you that hey, there is a work balance that is possible in the end of the day. These are the same people that are actually privileged enough to actually able to maintain this in comparison to the middle class or to the lower class that have to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs at once just to make sure that they can provide food onto the table or put their children at home. This introduction is important already because it highlights why there's actually no probability in which it is actually possible in the status quo that you're able to uh, maintain work-life balance in the end of the day. When in the end, you already fail at it the moment that you aren't privileged enough to actually seek it. So why is the work-life integration something that's actually preferable, or at least a world in which it actually exists? Key framings then. One, we obviously envision a world where employees seek work-life integration in ways in which it means that people are probably going to be friends with their employees, for example, or at least people are actually going to be able to be hubby or friendly with the people that they work with as well. This means then that at the very least there's already a connection between employees up to the customer level as well, instead of just the generic stuff that you actually get in status quo. But obviously, where the interests of the general employee as well. Firstly, they obviously want to have the form of sustainability that they have. That's obviously why they work. They want to make sure that they still gain money, for example. They still have money to actually fund themselves, for example. Or secondly, they also want to be happy in the form of way that they're actually doing their work. Obviously, because it consists of your entire life, for example, because it goes to be 9 hours spent every day to actually be able to work and actually meet people there in your workplace, for example. But are the key nuances then? Obviously, what is the reason why stress actually happens in these employees in the first place? Something that we have to define is a prerequisite to all of the impacts that we're going to give. One, oftentimes, the reason why employees actually get stressed in the first place is because you obviously separate both of them and you only see the fun of the other side instead of actually having to make sure that you also see fun on the job spectrum as well. Or secondly, you also have to you don't see the patterns of efficiencies that you can actually make in making sure that you're effective into making your job much more less stressful. For example, having to be in vacation and while you're bored, while you're waiting for your flight, for example, you're able to do your job on the get go because you're obviously not just separating and saying it, oh, it's just me time, for example. But obviously, third framing them, what is the integration of work and life balance actually look like? Number one, it probably means as well that there's a form of acceptance there that is going to be something that's going to be part of your life, for example. This means then that at the end of the day, these people are going to probably be incentivized to actually look joys onto what can actually be coming up from these works, for example, right? Or secondly, probably you're probably going to set boundaries for people that you love because I don't know, you probably want to pursue something in terms of your job, for example, right? So obviously, what are the arguments that we're going to posit? And this goes in three folds. One, where in terms of the individual, second on the institutional, and thirdly on the societal as well. So where is the individual level actually better off in this point later? One, people will now find meaning in the work that they do instead of constantly treating it like a chore. It's simple. People only get burnt out when they do not allow themselves to immerse in the intricacies of day-to-day life, for example. This is exactly why we don't sometimes appreciate the little efforts that we get from our friends because it's something that we just see as something different from our life, for example. But the moment that you integrate these two things, it also means that you're able to value it much more, for example, or at the very least, the society that you live in as well values the type of work that you actually get, which will be extended later on. Secondly, then, people now most likely align themselves with the work that they like instead of forcing themselves into just, I don't know, having high paying jobs, even though it's toxic. It means then, because they're able to integrate their life, they're able to actually look at it and align themselves to the interests that they want or the passions that they want in life, for example, before they take a course, for example. This means then that you already don't alienate different working fields that happens right now in status quo, where, for example, liberal arts isn't something as big anymore because people don't actually align themselves with it anymore because of the reenactment that, oh, it's not something big or important anyways because it's separate outside of my life. Thirdly, then, people will now have more conviction in leaving workplaces that they find toxic or don't tolerate exploitation. The incentive is simple. The moment that you value your life, obviously everyone values their lives. The moment you value your work as well, incomprehensible into that life, it means that you're probably incentivized to actually opt out of things that are actually toxic to you. Like, for example, if you had a toxic ex, you wouldn't stay with that toxic ex, for example, because it's part of your life. The same thing of value that you actually get from work, for example, you make sure that it doesn't happen to you constantly, that you aren't exploited constantly. Obviously, this means that the opt-out mechanism is much more better off, and you're able to actually hold your companies much more accountable. Thirdly, then, people now clamor for better workplaces, and because where, for example, they're able to clamor now much more for better workspaces because the value in which they input in their life as well or in their work as well means that they realize that they're going to spend their most of their life in work, means they're probably not going to tolerate the exploitations or the mechanisms that make sure that there's systematic oppression. For example, this looks like women in the work job, for example, being treated lesser compared to men, for example, where it's sometimes tolerated because they have to provide food in the table. With this type of mechanism, then they're able to actually go ahead and get more clamor, and they're more convicted to actually do so because they understand that this is something that they'll have to live 24 by 24, right? Two, and the societal level, then it's very simple. The state now have this incentive to invest more in education in comparison to them. The moment that you're able to actually nurture, or your a society develops in actually valuing the work in your life as well, it means that there's going to be an implication where societies will probably invest in education more, given that the fact that their
POI.
own people are able to value it. POI. 3, 2, 1. Okay, moving on then. It means then that the education that you have in this type of world probably means that it's going to be better as well. In the second analysis, then the state has more incentive as well to improve labor policies, for example, an incentive to have policies that make sure that opting out is actually okay. Because in this world, you have people that are actually moving out from their jobs because they understand that this is toxic, for example. This means then that the state has the incentive to not make sure that their unemployability is huge. They're going to probably co-opt all the benefits and making sure that companies are able to actually hire, for example, in terms of masses, for example, or at least making sure that the employees that they have is actually going to be happy because the state receives much more backlash now because people are now already concerned of whether or not the companies that they work in are ethical or not. This means then, by in a degree, it means that society already elevates in terms of policies and safety nets that make sure that people on the ground or people that are employees or the middle class or the lower class are actually able to achieve some form of safety nets in the case in which they're or they're going to opt out, or at the very least, they're not going to be exploited in the end of the day. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
We thank the previous speaker for the speech. Now to open the clash of op, we now call on LO here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, audible.
Just give me a second to fix my notes. Starting my speech in 3, 2, wait, yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Integration is nothing more than a veiled excuse for work to take over your entire life under capitalism. We think that it's on government where you're not just integrated in work, but you're consumed by it immediately. The first thing that I want to explain in this debate is as to what it exactly means to seek work-life balance. We think that it's only on our side where people are going to be able to see the need to invest in both aspects of their life, not just work, but also in their personal endeavors. This means that you see it as separate but equally important. So this means that if, for instance, you accept a new job offer, we think that it's only on our side where you're more likely to consider how longer hours are likely to affect your personal endeavors. In terms then of what exactly the exact process of seeking then is going to look like, we think that this means that this means at the point where employees are going to seek specific contracts, companies in turn are going to respond in kind because that's just how the job market works. But two, we also just think that at the point where this is something that is particularly important for people and this is what they seek, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of what they want out of the larger political environment, this means that becomes a talking point for instance, for elections, it's just going to be far more focused on balance on our side. How then do we think the world changes changes from the narratives that we propose. We think that what we have to clarify is that this is a this house prefers motion, right? A lot of government problems just exist in the status quo, such as, for example, the harm that they pose on opposition, that you're going to end up spending more time on in work without enjoying it. We think that it's only on opposition where we're able to use this fiat properly that we are able to create something better. So notice is in the status quo, we would rather create a world that from the start we have more work-life balance, and this is something that people actively push for. From this, we get two things. The first is that given the fact that we seek balance from the start, this means things such as larger union, such as more unions, larger labor movements, more protests from right. Insofar as this is something that people value, this also values far more. This also exists to a greater degree. But secondly, we also just think that the idea of balance within the status quo that government pushes is problematic, insofar as that just creates a lot of narratives insofar as this creates a lot of narratives for why you need to work. Because on our side, we just internalize the idea of balance far more. We think that people in general just want to push for a lot. Secondly, then, what exactly does government have to defend? I think that government just generally runs a very flimsy case, right? Where they aren't able to address a lot of the realities of what they have to contend with. On either side, pleasure is going to exist. The difference is as to whether or not you're going to view work as being separate from that pleasure and how you attain it. There are two important things then to note from government that they aren't able to completely build on their side. The first is that integration inherently is going to manifest under capitalism. Insofar as work inherently has a profit motive where these companies are going to want to keep you in your work for a longer amount of time, it's only on our side where we're able to create a counterbalance where people are going to be pushed back. But secondly, we also just think that at the point in time where you combine a lot of things that are particularly important in people's lives, it's just very difficult to distinguish whether or not this is something that you need to opt out of. So by the end of this, even by setup, I think we're able to prove quite concretely that a lot of government case is already not standing. First argument then on worker welfare. Why do we think work-life balance? We get more work-life balance that gives individuals more ability to pursue their lives amid the need for productivity. We think there are three reasons as to why you need to seek work-life balance. Note that in order to get work-life balance, the prerequisites are simple. That one, you need to have a lot of time to be able to pursue things that are going to give you pleasure. So, for example, you need time to be able to go out with family. But two, we also just think that you need a lot more money and a lot of resources to be able to have a capacity to pursue this. The reason as to why you don't get any of these things on-site government is because they're never able to push as to how you create that change, other than to just say that because integration, you're going to see work as more important, so you're going to try to mirror that work to that life. There are three reasons as to why we think it's better that they're separate. The first is because in the process of seeking for that counteracting narrative, we think that on an internal level, you're just going to want to advocate more for yourself. You're going to want to push for that specific split insofar as you think that your life should be valued outside of just the context of whether or not you're a good employee. But secondly, on an external level, we think that there's just a lot of pushback against corporations to push the narratives where you need to be happy within your work. Understand that this is on your side where you have this idea of integration, where it means that oftentimes if people aren't happy at that point in time, but they don't see an ability to have that change, they're just going to give up because they see that life as this. With the separation in that work, you know that even if you get fired, that's not the end all be all. The second reason as to why we think we're just far better is because people just generally know that life shouldn't just be spent in the office, right? I mean that even if there is just you spend one bad day in that office and you fail your performance, you still know that you're going to be a good spouse, a good mother, etc. This means just on an internal level, you're just going to be far better. But thirdly, we think that it's also just good for the average person. Note that this is something that occurs outside the rich and poor paradigms, insofar as we think even the process of integration is going to be harmful. Insofar as there's an inherent difficulty of just combining everything and thinking that every consideration that you need to make needs to consider both of these things, we think that you're able to hold both of these ideas separately, that both are equally valued but in different ways. So for instance, in terms of being able to just pursue hobbies for hobby's sake, we think that you're able to do things that don't necessarily contribute to your skills building. So for example, if you want to debate but your major is engineering, we think that you're more able to do it on our side because you don't see everything as having to be integrated into that work paradigm. We think that this means that you're just able to remove a lot more notions of everything necessarily needing to have a purpose. Why is this exclusive then on government? Two things. The first is because integration on why is this exclusive then that you can't get this on government? The first is just on integration, right? We think at the point in time where you seek this, you acknowledge that the consequences of every aspect of your life are going to add up to the extent that you don't want to consider anything without necessarily thinking about work. So, for example, if you want to have a child, you're going to immediately think as to whether or not work can accommodate that because you want a further career. You're not going to consider as to whether or not that work is not important to you. But secondly, on external level, we think that externally you're just not able to get a lot of push for more rights on government. There's a limit insofar as work is necessarily seen as essential as part of this equation. We think that this is important because a majority are not doing the jobs that they want. Government says that this is the problem, right? However, I want to note that on either side, these people aren't going to be able to shift because these are the people who are there because they don't have a lot of options. They're still poor. So it is only on our side where we're able to provide them escape because they push back against that paradigm of you needing work. But secondly, then, I also want to just say that even if you don't care about individuals, we're just a lot more productive on opposition. At the point where you get work-life balance, you're able to seek things such as more hours. You're able to get proper compensation, shorter work weeks. Empirically, we think people just do better when they're far happier, but also more rested. So oftentimes they're going to be more motivated in the workplace. They're not going to do stupid mistakes because they need more sleep. So oftentimes we think that people are just going to be able to do more work in less hours that are of better quality. But secondly, because we are able to maintain that balance, people are just going to be far more professional. This means that even if there's something that's affecting their personal life, they're still going to perform to the same degree. So at this point where we're able to provide that separation and to explain why it's best for both individuals and for a society as a whole, I think we have to win this debate. We're the only team that refuses to sacrifice ourselves to the altar of capitalism.
Right. We thank the previous speaker for the speech. Now calling on BBM. You're here.
Hi, just give me a few moments to switch devices and also go to the bathroom because I've been holding it in since kanina. Hi, is this both audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Wait, do you guys to chat? I'll take one on. Let me turn on my. I'll take one on the fifth. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. Your work largely affects your life, and you should not downplay the gravity of your career choice just because of the mindset that, oh, these things can be separate. So, therefore, it's probably not a heavy decision to make, right? 3 responses to try up. The first is their argument of why you're likelier to internalize balance is actually unlikely. 2 reasons here. A, they don't define how people are likely to be satisfied with the dominant idea of the work-life balance. But secondly, as well, they simply do not give us the quantity by which people are supposed to be satisfied with that specific form of work-life balance, right? But with that, then I think the third response but C as well, they simply do not also prove why in instances where people who do want to work out of necessity or who do want to work because of passion are unlikely to be shamed. Oftentimes, on their end, parents are shamed for working too much. Women should focus on the household because of the fact that they need to maintain this balance without even taking into consideration if this is what these individuals actually want, right? But the second thing I want to respond to is a clarification. There are two main aspects to highlight in this world reset debate. A, your preferences as an individual, but B as well, biological structures. To preempt, if OP says that this introduction is bad because this biologically harms your children, or there are cortisol hormones in your brain that make you jittery and you can't properly live the life you want, we argue that's unlikely because now your biology is rewired from the fact that once you work more, you gain more dopamine and less cortisol hormones actually are released in your body. That's the essence of the world reset debate, right? But the third response I want to make then is people just like seek life integration, right? And it isn't us forcing all individuals to have to follow these things because obviously, two things I want to clarify here. A, by their logic, your work should not necessarily be completely logically connected to the hobbies that you do. And people can still obviously pursue these hobbies, even if initially people don't think they're inherently connected. But B, as well, if people do have a problem with you pursuing something that's not connected with your line of work, then you have the greater incentive to assess how these things can be integrated with one another. So if people see that debating is not connected with your K-pop idol career and you're a main rapper, then you realize, oh, debating actually helps me better enunciate three structural reasons with a Nicki Minaj rap collab, right? But without them, I want to note that the mechanism that was unresponded to from Gov are twofold. One, because it's a world reset debate, likely people's preferences have been shifted and their biological structures have been shifted towards gaining more forms of like work satisfaction, whether or not they pursue work or whether or not they pursue other hobbies and how they can relate these hobbies with their work, right? But the second thing that was unresponded to simply on our end is the fact that governments now have the greater incentive to reform the current systems to make sure that they aren't actually exploitative. And I'll further prove that. But the first extension I'm going to be making is why the positive material, seeking this integration is actually better for you long term. Three impacts here. A, obviously there's far better healthier relationships with your most proximate loved ones. But B, there's an urgency to assess early on that the gravity of your career choice heavily affects your life. But C, discovering new opportunities in terms of assessing how you can be able to integrate different careers or different aspects together, what inherently people thought might not be correlated can actually be connected with one another, right? Three reasons this is likely. The first reason is if you have a very different line of work with your family or loved ones, for example, like your parents work in clothing and you work in veterinary biology, A, there's an incentive for you to integrate these careers together so your family can boost your income together and the two of you can reach your goals, right? So if your parents want to create medical clothes for pets because they work in textile, then you can sell it in your vet clinic. But secondly, but B, this also proves that even if people have different passions, they're still able to maximize this into gaining more money. Or even if they don't want money, they can be able to discuss if whether or not these passions are something that they want. But the second reason is if you can't work together with your family, right, and your family still constantly has the pressure for you to really assess your decision because it heavily affects your life, integration also includes setting boundaries with the people you love because integration isn't just about similarity, it's also about recognizing how you as an individual can pursue the choices you want, which means that A, you emphasize what you want to pursue as early on in your life so your family gets to reassess that, oh, maybe the form of integration we should do is not forcing our child to have the same line of work, but us adjusting to make sure we can be able to support our child because of the fact that this career they want to pursue is heavily integrated with their life. But B, this also proves that the capacity to opt out early of people's expectations and societal pressure is far better so you can pursue what you want early on your career. Comparatively on op, there are two tangible harms that are worse off. One, you're likely to be stuck in a career choice you hate because of the fact that you didn't properly assess these things. But two, the time you lost from not properly assessing or choosing your passion. But three, as well, you're less likely to learn how to be able to find meaning in your work because A, they do not quantify what the specific work-life balance looks like on their end. But B, they do not prove why people are likelier to have like the same like leaning or to have the same preference on that specific type of work balance, right? This is likely because A, obviously you downplay the gravity of your career choice and you can just separate hobbies from your work. But B, your family also prioritizes practicality instead of passion and they pressure you to choose a money-making career at the expense of your mental health. Sure.
So since Gov realized late on that this house prefers, would you also fiat out just humans fatiguing?
Yeah, we're gonna be fiating that out. But even if on our worst case, right, where your version of self-actualization means you have limited options, and the simple response to that is one, this isn't inherently bad because obviously even if people's preferences are not as expansive or the opportunities they have are limited, they've already learned to be fulfilled with the options they have. But secondly, as well, I just think it's far better on our end precisely because the fact that there's greater incentive for create these things together. But the second argument here simply on government accountability. Notice this is far worse off on up because one, governments become a lot more complacent, society becomes a lot more complacent, do not assess the fact that the decisions and your career choice in life should be properly assessed as early as possible as well. But secondly, social movements aren't able to specifically strategize the narratives, the policies they want to lobby for in Senate court hearings to make sure they provide far better opportunities for the marginalized because of this complacency on their end, right? But the impact of this is simply one, since obviously comparatively on our end, because of the fact that it's a world reset system, people value their choice as much, so now they're incentivized to tackle the problem as early as possible. They can still leave a work or opt out of a specific form of work if they realize that's not for them, and they better able early on do that as much as possible because of the fact that this is something that heavily affects them, and there's
Alright, we thank the previous speaker for the speech. Now calling on DLO. Here.
Hi, can you hear me and see me?
Yes to both.
Let's steer this debate back to the actual important conversation. What Gov explains and all of their material is relative to status quo, not a world wherein work-life balance is something that employees have sought historically. This is very clearly what the debate is about, and all of their things you cannot clearly understand. I know, panel, you cannot clearly understand what is it relative to, what do they mean by it's something that is more, simply because they were not able to paint or counterframe what it's like on our side when there's a work-life balance historically. Responses. One, they say work-life balance is simply a lie. Again, this relative to status quo, we frame this out, but even to be very charitable, this is something that is not a privilege when you talk about work-life balance. Sure, work-life balance is a spectrum depending on things like poverty, but people still find personal time and value personal time a lot, even if they are overworked, simply because of the narrative of this big separation that they are two distinct entities. One, it simply happens more on our side when people are able to value these things because there's this historical seeking of it. And this seeking, if Mimi wasn't clear, the employee seeking this looks like collective action. Because of the simple incentive that you cannot get work-life balance if the law says you have to work 16 hours. These are the similar reasons to why unions were striking for 8 hours instead of 16 hours, but instead these things will be amplified on our side historically from the start of the Industrial Revolution, simply because you want this work-life balance and every employee seeks this. Don't you understand the gravity of every single employee having a consensus that our things should be separate, that work destroys our life, and we should instead balance out work? Secondly, they say individuals find meaning in work more. This is in contradiction to their analysis of more people simply leaving because on their side, they have more reasons to stay in shitty jobs if they get meaning from it. We have more people leaving simply because they do not get meaning from this, right? And they want to seek meaning. Therefore, meaning is actually made more in your personal life because you have more autonomy and emotional connection to that personal life. They explain meaning without explaining the structural reasons why someone working in an Amazon factory will get meaning from it. In fact, in status quo, we see people pretending to be anime characters to just get a semblance of meaning. We deny status quo. We prefer that throughout history, people wanted a work-life balance. Next thing they say is that stress comes from separation and not seeing the fun in jobs currently. No, this comes from jobs people simply don't like and terrible, shitty conditions. On our side, it is when you see how much better your personal life is that you compare and that you want better treatment in your own work. They don't prove, conversely, how people see meaning if many of these jobs are simply undesirable. They don't prove why people can simply enter jobs that they want. Next, they say work is more valued on their side. Work is only valued by the system in its absence. We saw this in worker strikes. We saw this within Xperia workers being able to gain more things. This you cannot easily strike on their side. In fact, I don't think there are any strikes on their side because your whole personal value system is connected to work. And this is important. Because if your whole value system and personality is connected to work, you fear the disruption of this. It is no longer the disruption of work as a separate entity. It is the disruption of your whole life. No one will join unions. We are fucked. On our side, you strike because work is ruining your life. Next thing they say is that it's more there's more clamor for labor rights. This is a reach, right? This is not exclusive, first of all, because work is still such a big part of life anyway. And what will happen instead is that your life becomes easier to write off on their side. If it is hard in the same way that people handle abuse in their own personal lives because they see a beauty in it, all of their framing and all of their mechanisms fail to their own goal. Next, they say you'll biologically adapt to this. No, this debate is from the Industrial Revolution. Cavemen cannot adapt. You cannot adapt to this in 200 years. But people will still get tired. People will still get poisoned by chemicals. They will not become X-Men on their side. This is weird. Next, they say it's better long-term because there's more gravity on career choice and more combination. I want to flip this and say this is very horrible because it's transactional and outcome based. If your parents don't like your football jerseys, if your football jerseys don't sell, if your IE degree doesn't come into fruition, like hopefully Hughes comes into fruition, it's just terrible. And your entire life and your personality gets undermined. And it's not just a separate thing that you can consider or that you can like cope with your own personal life. Next, you choose career you're happy with on their side. No. People want to do this either way, but are constrained by things like poverty. If there's no choice on either side, on our side, because you're separate, people understand it's something that they just need to do to make money. And therefore, they see the value of themselves outside of their career. Two substantives. One, on the issue of the economy. Mimi explained that there's more productivity with things like the 9-to-5 system being implemented historically. Like in the EU, there's an implementation of quota over hours, and people generate more value. This is something that is good, and this is better because productivity is based on people's personal preferences on our world. No town status quo, many people have to stay at work longer than they need to. With this narrative that emphasizes importance on developing your own life, workplaces restructure themselves, it's good for everyone. Next, this is where I clear up the differences in this debate. Integration versus balance. Integration on their side ends up with being consumed by work because the satisfaction of your life is linked on either side to your agency and your distance from undesirable activities and undesirable work conditions. Agency is therefore destroyed on Gov because employees don't own the means of production on either side, so there's not as much agency to choose these things, and there's not as much freedom. This clears it up. Lastly, if you don't buy any of that, on our side, there's a rapid development of culture and arts. So if we don't have a positive case, here it is. We have a positive case, right? But here's double the positive case. This is important because the humanities, culture, and arts are catalysts for social change and understanding different viewpoints, self-actualization. How does this happen? One, free time breeds creativity. Creativity usually comes from personal experiences. You have more free time when employees seek time and space away from work and they don't think about work. People will spend more time on reading, making art, developing their hobbies, making music like in my band, Moonjim City, organizing events. This is all because people have an affinity for these things naturally. People have always wanted art naturally. Work has lessened the amount of art or created AI like slop shitty art, right? Status quo and opposition takes this away. Why is this analysis exclusive? One, most people cannot see creativity in their own work because it's usually too calculated in this work. They don't have time. They're discouraged in the work itself. But integration will likely water down culture and arts development because people are less encouraged to do things just for the sake of it. They have to profit. They have to profit again and again. Capitalism therefore makes you feel guilty if your art does not sell, and your life will feature more and more competition than collaboration if we assume capitalism is symmetric. The impacts are simple. There's more criticism of unjust systems with humanities and art. There's more happiness and self-actualization. There's more stronger communities that come together over organizing art events and like doing things like journalism, like OJ, right? And next, there's more reason to simply live for individuals. So if you don't just don't buy all the ways that government tries to co-opt this because they are not like relative to our world. They're relative to status quo. We don't want status quo either. We want work-life balance to be amplified to the max 100% Betamax. Thank you.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech. Now calling on Goblet. Here.
Hi, can I confirm if I'm audible?
Yep, audible.
All right. Just turning this on. Hello. All right. So I've also been holding in my thing, so I'm just gonna go finish that real quick. But opening my cam just to Okay, I'm back. Hello, YouTube. Just gonna set up my recorder. Oh, by the way, this is being recorded anyway, so I'm also just gonna assume you consent to having your POI recorded if ever. Happy Mother's Day. I'll be starting my speech in a bit. Just let me arrange. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2. Oh, right, by the way, POI is at 5th. I'll take one, I promise. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The average person spends 8 to 10 hours of each day of their lives absent of the rare days off or vacation times at work, right? And I think to some extent, opposition does have an understanding of that, but they stay on the pessimistic side. They say that it is in work that we find a lot of unhappiness. It's something that means we have to prioritize a lot of our personal lives more, etc., etc. I think the problem with this is that generally they work under the same assumption of what the work-life balance tries to prove, that work is something that inherently, if it engulfs your life, apparently it consumes you, it makes you totally unhappy. But I think that this debate could be won on a more rational, reasonable level in which you actually look at it from a third-party perspective. Obviously, it's not true that to some extent work, if it engulfs your life, is bad. That means that a lot of people who actually value their work and actually like the fact that would like to stay in work, for example, which is still a significant amount of people, actually wants to stay, right? And that kind of just demeans their whole livelihood. But the thing that I have to discuss here is two things specifically in terms of accountability and just where employees are generally happier. And I'll just jump straight into it so that we get a more nuanced picture of why we're proceeding to grants. Firstly, in terms of accountability, right? And I feel like the first discussion I need to present under this is what are the things that we already preempted coming from government in terms of the things that, opposition just decided to ignore from LO down to DLO. Safety nets. We told you about how the protection of job security is something that is heavily important because it is something that is likely to happen in a world where work-life integration is something that the majority, or at least everybody or of employees that typically seek, which means that kind of integration gives states incentive to prioritize that kind of job security by making sure that not only do people get to opt in better, like for example, culturally starting it young, making sure that there's proper educational levels, that there's more investment in it, the fact that they also invest more in terms of job protections, making sure that they sanction corporations, making sure that when people do choose to opt out, there's a higher amount of severance, for example, or the fact that it's likelier that companies are likely to enjoy more in the competition and likely going to invest more in making sure that people feel safe in the jobs that they choose to pursue, because it's literally their whole life in the perspective that this world sets on, which means that this is the general psyche that people have. It's likelier that they're going to get angrier, they're likely to push for more accountability. And I think that in turn is something that they never really responded to, but two, that comparison is inherently clear in how ops main push is that work consumes you completely and you can only have better if you pursue more time for personal life. I'll give two responses to this to make it more specific. Firstly, notice how the way that they describe balance isn't actually nuanced to any of the harms that they discuss. Notice that their discussion on separation isn't actually something that it doesn't actually prove that separation is likely to make you happier as an individual. If anything, even if it does prove it, it only proves it for a small margin of people, in which Albert already told you is likely to be those who are more privileged, who are likely reaching higher incomes to begin with, the nepo babies, the people who can safely say that work-life balance is something that works for them, whereas the general amount of people do have to work, and in that instance, the conclusion is the tipping point of how they perceive that particular work in turn affects how they work on in life in general and how they pursue other aspects of it. But secondly, that integration, at the very least on our end, increases the depth, meaning, and significance of work to your life. That means that you're willing to stake more in order to protect it, which means that people are likelier to call out their bosses, likely to call out their supervisors if they're harassing them, for example. They're likelier to make sure that they push for more opportunities like the LO's extension on art and cultivation. I don't understand why this doesn't just increase into more awareness and more education and more improvement in terms of allowing for culture and art to be better appreciated, which can happen. They can start their own organizations, for example. The field isn't limiting to being simply a low-level employee. But even if it's true, this is outweighed by the nuance of how the work-life balance acts as a narrative to people in status quo. And I feel like we've proved that sufficiently by the fact that it is something that inherently tries to make sure that you see work as something that's inherently negative. It's something you spend the majority of your time on. No imagine the amount of people who feel bad for staying in work a lot and that they cannot afford to have a better personal life or have more time for a personal life. But I digress. I'll talk about that more later. But second, opting out was something we already preempted from PM, even in the very, very worst case, right? Because people putting more stake in their jobs means the state has more stake in making sure that it's secure as well. So even if they get fired, etc., competition, etc., all of that already explained. I just think it's a discussion that we already inherently win by default. Second discussion, then, I feel like the majority of the debate also happened here, is where employees are generally happier, they're likely to feel more secure, etc. The first thing I want to discuss is that the main case of
POI.
opposition is in general later because it exists in isolation. They tell you people are happier when you give them more time to focus on things outside of work, and that's basically the gist of it. There's three levels of response to prove why this just doesn't work at all and is, like not subdued in reality. But firstly, people work on both ends of the house, right? And on their end, it's the people who have to work the most that are the most unhappy, especially the ones who are most vulnerable. I've already explained that earlier. Albert has already explained that. But the second level here is that people are constantly unhappy because they are missing out on half of their lives depending on which they value more. So this assumes that these people don't even have to be vulnerable, right? So they can't assume that people just generally value their personal lives more on opposition, or at least in the current world, because that's where it hinges their self-actualization model on. It just doesn't work for the vast majority of people. They needed to prove that the people can actually achieve that balance, and to what extent that can actually happen, or that's what incentive the state has to actually impose that. But yeah, capitalism's a bitch. I feel like we all agreed on that. It's not something that's likely going to just let you break free and have more time to yourself, right? And that's a general attitude we give. We already tell you why it's just much better on our end. But before I proceed, short, yeah.
On the side that you'll push for work to be better regardless, just so that those hours spent there are good. I don't get as to why it's exclusive.
Value as being separate, it means that you also like mismanage the allocation of where your attention is put on. It means that you're likely to view one side more negatively, whereas if you put all sides together, you actually have more incentive to make sure that every aspect of your life is better, right? And I think to that extent, the incentive for people to actually make their lives better on your end is just worse. But see, assuming what the LO says is true, that even if it's something people aren't capable of balancing, they still find value in the little time that they have. That's their world. But on our world, you could put that value in literally everything. So DLS, as I told you about DLO's extension and cultural arts, for example. But even if you don't believe that, right, this is where Sean's extension actually shines the most, because generally the culture of how people see work is just more fun and meaningful, and this is absolutely the tipping point, because it's how people see work that's the main difference in both worlds, right? Because it mitigates the scale of people feeling like they're burnt out, because it means that to the worst extent that they feel burnt out, they would maximize their efforts into trying to make sure that it actually happens, some kind of security actually happens. But B, even if that wasn't true, this world preempts that by starting the culture out young, which means work being integrated with your personal life makes people make sure that enter into as safe and as enjoyable a space as possible when they actually enter the workplace. So that means like being more picky with what university you choose to go to or what field you choose to go to, making sure that people are aware of the work that you want to push through, some of the problems and the issues that they have with it. So sure, maybe at least in our world, people find some form of enjoyment in packing bags for Amazon, which by the way was a problematic example, but because it means it. But still, at the very least, even if that's a job you have to do and that's your whole personal life, at least you're happy doing it. I think it's only possible for that level of enjoyment to bleed into other aspects of your life if you work with government. Thank you. See you in
We thank the previous speaker for that speech. Now calling on Opwet.
Oh, hello. Audible, visible.
Yes,
Okay. Um, okay. 3, 2, 1, go. I don't think government understands that it isn't just about work and being friends with your boss so that you can get magically better conditions. It's the fact that work doesn't let you have a personal life. It makes your work worse and it makes other aspects of your life worse too, which is why we advance. The first thing that I want to talk about is just what is and isn't exclusive, because I think government does quite a bad job at doing that. The first thing that I want to note is that they say that you can get less toxic workplaces through like regulation and whatever. The problem with this is that obviously, we agree that there's still going to be some capitalistic structure on either side. So if it is the case on their side that companies want to retain employees and keep them happy, the same amount of incentive exists on either side. But this is where we flip it. Because under their side, because you are encouraged to make personal life your work life, right? They consider them, by the way, that's not me saying it, it's them saying it from all the way from PM when they were like, you should be buddy-buddy with your coworkers, you should get to know your boss more, etc. It's more difficult to actually complain about these conditions because you see them as a tightly knit part of your personal life, right? You don't want to get into altercations with your boss because your boss is also part of your social circles. That's the problem that happens under their side when there is no distinction because you're just not able to clamor for these things in general. But the second thing that I want to point out that isn't exclusive is this idea on the government investing in education. And I want to note they dropped this in the later speeches, and probably for good reason. Because on either side of the house, the government wants people to be like employable and they want them to focus on upskilling so that they can work. Like, I'm not sure why this is exclusive at all, so that's just chucked out of the round. First issue then that I want to talk about is better worker welfare, and I think both teams concede that this is quite important, quite a core part of the debate. The first thing that I want to note is why do we get just better working conditions and better balance in general? And this is where we bring back the nuance of what this house prefers part and specifically what the seeking part means. Because this wasn't a debate about whether or not you should learn to value work and learn to find some happiness in it, which is what the Gov team was kind of debating. Like, sure, that's some part of it, but the point was asking what we wanted workers to have demanded from the very start of history, right? From the start of like around the Industrial Revolution or until around that part, what workers would have preferred if they clamored for having less time off or just for having better conditions while they were at work and those kinds of things. And this is where like the weighing comes in, right? I'm gonna point out that all of the things that they explain actually happens on either side, happens to both in both sides to a great extent. Because if they say that companies want to keep you because of things like profit incentives, then that just happens on either side. So that's why like they are, they offer all these kinds of things, right? And the reason why that is important is we were able to prove that we get a counterbalance. So companies and governments on either side are incentivized to want to keep workers happy while at work, right? Because to some extent that makes them productive, makes them find meaning, whatever. The point is that nobody is advocating for less time off except for workers, which is why there was a necessary counterbalance. So at the end of this, right, you weigh it in two things. The first is that we just get far more optionality. But secondly, if anything, the only way we're able to get worker welfare was because workers historically threatened to stop working, right, if their conditions didn't improve. This is the problem because under their side, they're implying that the only way to get that is through, internal means, through being sociable and through finding meaning within your own work instead of just threatening to quit it entirely. This threat to quit is the, like main mechanism as to why you have things like strikes and why you actually got workers' rights. So at the end of this discussion, it's just quite clear that we get more worker welfare because we're able to clamor for it more because you don't gaslight yourself into like just liking your job, even if it's like terrible. But the second thing that they say under this is that you're able to get opt-out. And I would suggest that this is just hard to do because companies can have the leverage and all those kinds of things. But it's much harder to do, as I pointed out, when your friends are literally the same set of people who are also your co-workers, right? Because you want to integrate work. Like they discouraged having a personal life as they conceded in the previous speech. But secondly, the other reason as to why it's just hard to do is because all you've done for the entirety of your life, because you integrated work, this work balance, you have work integration, which means that everything that you've done throughout your entire life just culminated towards how you can be a better worker in that specific job, which means that it's incredibly hard for you to opt out of it and explore other fields because you never dabbled in other fields. Because as precisely what DLO said, DPM said, you make it such that your hobbies are connected to your work and find ways to make your work more innovative, quote unquote, which means that in the moment that you decide that it's not for you, all of your skills are adjacent or directly related to the job that you have, which makes it even harder for you to opt out. So if anything, it's harder for them to opt out and actually get those forms of accountability. And this is where our counterfactual comes in. We explain to you why work-life balance becomes necessary. In response to this, they say that one, you can always opt into a job that you can eventually learn to like, which is the argument coming from PM. The first is that, listen to their own argument as well. They say that some people just do not have the privilege to not work often, to like work less hours. If that's true, then more people don't have the privilege to choose the job they like, which implies that these people cannot just randomly, people cannot necessarily choose the job that they have some amount of passion to and they can connect to other jobs. So if anything, their option is far more inclusionary. So what does this mean then? This means that under their side of the house, worker welfare is just far worse because you're not able to get any sort of meaning from it, right? You're not able to explore other things that make you happy. You're not able to have other options through dabbling in hobby, other like alternate sources of income that you can use to detransition from your job if you don't like it. So on all their metrics, we're actually just flipping all of them and winning. But the second issue that I wanna talk about is productivity, right? And this is quite important because assuming that worker conditions are going to be relatively similar on either side of the house, we're able to demonstrate to you that you actually have better productivity under our side. So the framing here is that maybe we have slightly less time at work and then they have a slightly better time at work. Why is it still preferable to have slightly less time? We first pointed out that some jobs are just done more productively when workers are well rested. But okay, let's really assume that they can actually biologically fiat out fatigue or whatever. We also explained that people are just far more innovative and creative, right? Not just in terms of arts, which is what Elle told you, but what Mimi told you as well is that people are far more likely to be innovative, far more likely to actually dabble in other things that make them far more productive and do things like innovate, do things like think outside the box when they actually have the free time to do so, right? When they're not spending the every waking hour of their life just trying to meet the deadline or meet a certain quota of hours, right? That's when people are more likely to be productive, more likely to actually do the innovation that PPM was talking about. So at the end of all of this, I think it's quite straightforward that we just flip every single claim that they have, and that's why we're very proud to.
Right. We thank the previous speaker for his speech. Now calling on Op reply. Here.
Hi. Can I start? Yes.
Yep.
If Hugh's drumming was integrated with his engineering, I'm pretty sure he would be so much sadder. First question, what framing should you buy? Gov has a very assumptive line of logic that they want to win on, right? It is that integration leads to improving work because people want to do this. Take note, they don't have such a clear characterization of the different ways that integration manifests, and instead assert that this will be a fully agent way of integrating. That because employees somehow have so much more power on their side, so much more ownership over the means of production, that all of their impacts will accrue. One, their entire line of logic assumes people have enjoyable work or work that they can get enjoyment from. They assert that meaning making is possible with this integration without making the logical lines to this. What we prove on our side is that agency is what makes meaning, that you have freedom in your personal life that makes meaning. This is way more intuitive, and if you check back your notes, we were able to prove that. Secondly, they assume that job protection only happens with integration. This is where I want to be charitable. If you believe both analysis, I just want to be a judge for a sec. It's about extents, right? Like, we already proved that it's harder to want better jobs when protests and things like wanting to strike or the mechanisms that we explain are the only ways that you can get better work, like higher wages and stuff, disrupt your entire life and disrupt your entire personality, your entire value system, if we even take it at the best version of their integration that they explain. Third, they assume that people have free choice to choose the different work that they have. I think Hugh Mejos was able to call this out, but this just feels the normal eye test, like just simply, right? On our side, we don't rely on your work necessarily being good. We explain that you value your life, meaning that you want work to be better. That is why these distinctions are psychologically significant, right? Fourth, they take a lot of exclusivity by assuming the behavior of people. We don't really assume the behavior of people. What we instead explain is that our logic is that behavior is determined by your social conditions and the agency that you're able to accrue by choosing what to do in your personal life. When you have all the cards laid out for you, what do you choose to do? Do you choose to join 9 orgs like OJ, or do you choose to do music like me and you? This is in comparison to what Gov tries to explain, that people only want better work conditions if it is like completely in their life and if there's a risk of ruining their entire life. Take note, this is not exclusive because your life still gets ruined despite there being a distinction, but also we are just able to weigh this out, and I don't fully prove why this happens anyway. Next question. What makes labor conditions improve? I think this is a very important point, right? One, we explained labor conditions improve when you have a straightforward way to resist capitalism, to resist corporations squeezing you out. On the converse, Gov has to jump through many hoops to simply want improvement in the first place. They assume the psychology of the average person or the average employee is going to be, oh, because work and life are integrated, I immediately want this work to be so much better. No, a lot of things like capitalism, because they're symmetric, we explain they're still going to coerce you, which we explain are still going to make a lot of your lives transactional, that we explain will worsen things because it's completely outcome based, an analysis that I gave that was unresponded to. Secondly, labor conditions improve when you have the distinction to compare your life to something and you aren't always working and you aren't always in the mindset of working. This is important because as we were able to characterize things like workers' protests and disrupting, and like what I said, like how labor is valued in the absence of it within Xperia workers' strike, all of these things were organized within people's free time. And that's important. Thirdly, labor conditions improve when you have a counterbalancing narrative to companies wanting to squeeze you dry on either side. Fourthly, you have more like labor conditions improve with things like economic prosperity and productivity, which is something that Mimi was able to explain in her last 30 seconds. I was able to explain in like the 4th minute mark. And this was unresponded to. So if you don't believe anything else, at least you have to trust that arts will improve, that productivity will improve, that work-life balance is a great world to live in. Oppose.
Thank you for your speech. Now the end of the debate, we now call on Gov reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I just want to wash out 2 clashes on their end. They claim that 1, improving labor conditions, but 2, innovation and productivity are the most important clashes in Iran. But what they fail to understand coming from Gov is A, if you do not get the prerequisite benefit of learning to find solace and fulfillment within these things, then obviously it proves that these things aren't the most important clashes in Iran. The first observation I want to make in Iran is what the main crux of a debate should be in terms of where you find satisfaction and solace regardless of your situation, right? 3 things here. A, there's a contradiction on up. If they tell us that work is unbearable, they don't prove why you're able to stomach the agony of spending hours at your desk job. But B, even if there's an attempt at minimizing corruption on their end and improving labor conditions by telling us that A, you can call out your boss better because you're not friends, but B, simply labor unions are far better off because you're not close with people. I think there's simply 2 things that they ignore that destroys that claim. 1, precisely because you're detached from your boss, you're a lot more scared to call them out because you're like not close to these people and you don't know the capacity of abuse that they're likely to inflict on you. But 2, people are a lot more likely to delay these decisions as well, right? Because of the fact that they feel, especially on their end, they do not prove why you have enough money to be able to sustain yourself, right? Why you're likely to call out these abusive individuals. Comparatively on our end, 1, precisely because people around you, likely coming from our fame, if the people that you work with are your family, or you develop a super duper close bond because you integrate them with your life, A, they're a lot more likely to become empathetic with you. So they're a lot more likely to be understanding of your situation and want to help you as well, right? But C as well, even if this system is corrupt and will never change at all, and people can't afford to have a personal life. Notice that comparatively on ops end, A, they don't prove how people can learn to find the fulfillment on theirs, especially if B, the government, their very fame proves why the government is a lot more likely to be corrupt. On their end, you have a never-ending form of agony without even proving why the explicit benefit of learning how to find satisfaction in those forms of things are something that ultimately keeps you sustained in life, keeps you satisfied, right? Comparatively on our end, well, even if A, your family is going to be, the family members who are working with you is going to be gaslighting you to like just learn to love your work, or B, you'll never be able to find any form of improvement within your labor conditions, right? Just us engaging in our very worst case. At least that's still far better because A, obviously you make sure you still continue to live. Like, what are you really gonna do if you just sulk there and you can't change your situation? At least you learn to find meaning and solace in these things, right? But the second clash I want to like slightly engage in is, sure, even if productivity and maximizing opportunities is still something that has value in Iran, I want to clarify two things. One, the mechanism of free time still exists on our end. In fact, it's better because because of the fact that you learn to find solace and satisfaction within your job, despite your shitty working conditions, you're better able to also recognize that your free time is something that you shouldn't spend your time doing wasteful things, but also pursue other aspects as well. Because of the fact that you don't need to relieve that stress because you aren't stressed in work at all, right? But the second thing as well that's standing in this clash is in terms of simply just the incentive for people to discover new things. On their end, they say, well, if these things are separate, you'll be able to discover new perspectives without necessarily proving why that's likely. Comparatively, on our end, there were three reasons unresponded to. A, because of the fact that you have the incentive to learn how to integrate different aspects of your life with one another, you're better able to B, maximize the opportunities you have in terms of making more money, precisely because of the fact that you don't resent your work. But C, comparatively as well, you also now better communicate with your family in terms of the way that you're supposed to maximize your opportunities together. The crux of their impacts are contingent on finding solace and satisfaction. And if they don't prove that, they ultimately don't win the debate.
Right. We thank the previous speaker for the speech, and we thank all the debaters for the rally. We now virtually across the house. Just kindly go back to the convening room and for the